We have the testosterone category with its derivatives as well. We have DHT and the DHT derivatives, and then we have the 19-NORs, derivatives of 19-NOR testosterone. What's up, guys? Derek, moreplaysmoredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about the anabolic steroid family tree, which is not something I came up with. This is something that has, I guess been passed through the grapevine or, passed around our community. I don't know who originally came up with this or not, but it's basically a very, concise and easy way to identify in general the targeted action of certain anabolics and how they impact athletic performance, body composition, cosmetic, aesthetic appeal, I suppose, as well, in terms of drying out, effect on increasing the androgen load relative to the estrogen load in the body, and how this is going to impact dry graininess and whatnot. Just like a million different things to consider, but in general, things break down to stuff like actual accrual of contractile tissue, like new muscle, antagonism of glucocorticoid receptors to prevent protein degradation and kind of support protein accretion, nitrogen retention, psychoactive effects on the brain in terms of driving like motor learning, neurology, stronger, more aggressive training, stimulation of erythropoietin, red blood cell count for, endurance and athleticism and whatnot. There are a few things that really come to mind as the main benefits or attributes of certain compounds relative to one another that really are going to influence at the end of the day what kind of things are being chosen in what aspects for certain goals in Olympic sports, in whatever it is, basketball, UFC, bodybuilding, going to the fucking beach, I don't know, whatever the outcome is. These things all have a certain, attribute that may be more beneficial than another, or a lack thereof of side effects that would then qualify one over another, even if it was objectively less ideal in a certain situation than another. But in general, this is sort of like the breakdown of things. You have the testosterone and testosterone derivatives. So we have testosterone, which is the parent hormone of all of this, and we have boldenone, also known as equipoise or EQ. Then we have dianabol or D-bol, methandrostenolone. We have turinabol, T-bol, a more refined and targeted compound than D-bol. We have halotestin as well. We have what else? We have DHB is not really. It's technically a DHT derivative, I suppose, as is the 5-alpha reduced metabolite of boldenone, and while it is basically enzymatically converted via 5-alpha reductase from boldenone, which is essentially in the testosterone family, it is often lumped into the DHT derivative category. But anyways, you could, argue some people argue it's its own category entirely, but just for general, convenience sake, we're just putting it here. But those are the main ones. We have testosterone, EQ, D-bol, halo, T-bol, and that's essentially it. So then we look at the next category, which is the DHT and DHT derivatives. So this is the dihydrotestosterone is the 5-alpha reduced superandrogenic metabolite of testosterone that heavily influences, progression through puberty, viralization, basically anything androgenic related is heavily influenced in the body by DHT and is the main hormone responsible for literally progressing you through puberty. And this is why pseudo-hermaphrodites who are 5-alpha reductase deficient or have mutations in the gene develop, micropenises, but also don't have temporal recession or very much facial hair and whatnot. So anyways, before getting too off track, DHT is very androgenic, but its derivatives are more refined to create more tissue selective compounds and are actually pretty efficacious in many, many contexts for athletic enhancement. So DHT derivatives that are of note. First, we have drostanolone, also known as Masteron. We have oxandrolone, also known as Anavar. We have methanolone, also known as Primobolan. We have oxymethylone, which is also known as Anadrol. We have What else do we have in this family here? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. We have stanozolol, also known as Winstrol. We have Mysterolone, also known as Proviron. And then we also, some might argue that DHB belongs in this family, and I guess, that's up for debate. But anyways, that's those are the main ones in this category. Then we go on to the 19-nortestosterone and its derivatives. A lot of people don't realize 19-nors is essentially just the title of a category of compounds that are all derived from nandrolone as the parent hormone. So a lot of people think 19-nor, most people don't even know what 19-nors mean, but 19-nortestosterone is the actual, chemical name for nandrolone essentially. And or at least one of them, and derivatives of nandrolone were then tweaked and modified by scientists in order to create things like trenbolone, things like trestolone, also known as ment. Those are the main ones that come to the top of my head. Steranabol as well, which is something that's interesting that I've noted before. Nilevar, these are like really not common ones that are a lot less relevant, so they're not really worth noting right now, but apparently were somewhat efficacious in athletic, enhancement in the past, but without, getting too off track with like the less notable ones, just stick to the basics here. We have the testosterone category with its derivatives as well. We have DHT and the DHT derivatives, and then we have the 19-nors, derivatives of 19-nortestosterone. And in general, the 19-nors is essentially only comprised of nandrolone, trenbolone, and ment in terms of like a traditional bodybuilder, powerlifting, whatever context. So how do all these different categories, it's kind of the first thing is to note that these categories each inherently have their own general characteristics that are similar to one another in their own respective families. So testosterone, those are things that are going to aromatize, are often thought to be, the main characteristic or attribute of them is you have testosterone, which aromatizes via the enzyme aromatase into estradiol, which then provides, neuroprotection and cardio protection in the body, and is what essentially, facilitates a healthy environment for somebody to even have androgens being created in the first place that isn't going to just like wreak havoc on their brain in a male. So that's testosterone. Then we have EQ, which also interacts with aromatase, but to a much lesser extent. And it's thought to be, 50% of what testosterone is in terms of its activity with aromatase and how much it creates in terms of estrogen conversion. In reality, I would like to see that played out in actual high sensitivity blood work using liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry and not a electrochemiluminescence immunoassay result, because I believe that it's likely the same outcome as something like nandrolone, whereby there is a random statistic pulled out of thin air saying it aromatizes 20% as much as test, but when you actually look at blood work, it does not appear to be the case whatsoever. So I surmise that EQ likely has a similar outcome, because there are actual testosterone derivatives that have zero interaction with aromatase and are not substrates for it, but are still in the testosterone category and family, even though they don't, share the same characteristics and more or less behave like a different category in general, which is what I'm going to delve into now. But as far as stuff that is like traditional testosterone and testosterone derivatives and sort of behave like one another, you have testosterone, boldenone, dianabol, which all more or less interact with aromatase, convert into estrogen to some extent, regardless if that's estradiol or a form of methyl estradiol or whatever. The same sort of like effects in general in terms of they're anabolic, but not like incredibly anabolic to the point with it where they have insane tissue selectivity. They both can, be like potent androgen replacement. They're sort of like a middle ground of providing enough accrual of tissue, driving neurological function, neuroprotection, driving these same processes as a DHT derivative in terms of its effect in a neurological component, as well as sort of having a bit of the volume from a 19-nor kind of thing. It's not like they take those characteristics from them. I'm just saying they resemble sort of like a middle ground between the two polar opposites. And then on the other side of the spectrum, and in addition to that, Turinabol and Halo, which are testosterone derivatives, do not necessarily behave like this family, which is why there are exceptions to this general rule, which is sort of why I'm explaining it in such elaborate detail right now. DHT derivatives are more or less targeted action on contractile tissue, which is why they do not, and they're commonly perceived to be weak anabolics, when in reality it's the lack of perceived side effects being misinterpreted as weak. So when it actually comes to nitrogen retention, we've seen in clinical studies that there is not a significant difference between things like Primo, things like testosterone, things like nandrolone, things like this. But at the end of the day, it's their side effects manifesting themselves in, like physical symptoms that is often being misinterpreted as this compound is more potent than another. So if you fill your muscle with, like 5 pounds of water retention over a week from using Dianabol, is it more potent at building muscle than Anavar? Like, no, it's not. At the end of the day, when everything is said and done, the amount of like actual contractile tissue that is gained, it's not going to be something that is, the bulking drug is better than the DHT derivative. However, there's obviously caveats to that, whereby, certain things that do increase intramuscular water retention, lubricate joints, give you cushioning for gaining more strength in the gym, and supporting progressive overload and preventing injury from being way too dry from a DHT derivative in your off season. There's things that sometimes the side effects are actually desired outcomes, which is where it comes into complicate things a bit more. But I'm trying to not get like way off topic here and sort of stick to the general overview of everything, which is DHT derivatives are very targeted in their action and are typically low side effect ridden relative to things like testosterone and 19-nors, because there's not significant interaction with other things in the body that would need to be regulated and or mitigated with adjunct ancillaries and whatnot. So there's no like excessive estrogen conversion. They're not substrates for aromatase. There's no like crazy, progestogenic activity and whatnot. And in general, they're just very dry, lean, heavy strength builders. And this is where, athletes who are, at the top of a weight class, for example, or like UFC fighters and people who are trying to really drive aggression and, sort of neurological processes and mental clarity and sharpness and sort of the net, strength relative to like high force production with a relative lack of body weight gain. This is the sort of thing you see from the DHT derivative family relative to testosterone, which is more of a middle ground between volume and, pure, like protein expression. But again, there's caveats to that too, because you have things like in the testosterone family, like Turinabol and like halotestin, which behave similarly to DHT derivatives because they are not substrates for aromatase. So their action is similar to DHT derivatives. And then in the DHT derivative family, you have things like anadrol, which behave more like a 19-nor than like a DHT derivative. So there is exceptions to the rule. But again, this is just a general family tree here. And in general, the things like the proviron, not very anabolic, but anyways, you have the things like Primobolan, Masteron, Anavar, Winstrol. These have similar effects on body composition and expression on the accrual of contractile tissue and strength gain. Like you'll often hear, how amazing Anavar is for building strength and performance, driving, very, very good improvements in force production, but with a relative lack of increases in body weight. And is this a, like downside of the compound? It depends what you're trying to accomplish here. And this is where, picking the right compound in the right category, depending on the athlete's goals in question, is, very critical to consider. It's not just a cookie cutter, you're trying to gain muscle, here's testosterone and this. You know what I mean? Here's your base with testosterone and here's this. There's like very, very specific and individual specific conditions. And this is not considering individual response side effect wise. This is not considering how deleterious a very specific compounds are going to be to health markers. There's like a million things to consider here. But again, in a general context, That's, what you can expect from the testosterone family, what you can expect from the Dht derivatives. Then you get into the 19-nors, which typically you would expect volume and, an increase in retention of certain things that are driven through their interaction with estrogen receptors and progesterone receptors as well, because these are progestogenic compounds whereby they interact with other receptors that would otherwise not necessarily touched by things like Dht derivatives, and they have a downstream effect on libido through activating progesterone receptors, which would otherwise have a, like anti-androgenic effect and sort of like, kill your libido in some contexts. You have things like trenbolone, and nandrolone, which inherently can activate estrogen receptors without even needing to interact with aromatase first. They can actually do their own inherent activation of estrogen receptors. Then things like trenbolone, it interacts with glucocorticoid receptors, which in itself is, largely why it excels so much in a recomp or a cutting phase, whereby it is way more muscle sparing than other compounds, even though in a calorie surplus, it may not excel to the same extent as it does in a deficit because of this interaction, this unique interaction with the receptor. There's certain characteristics of certain compounds in each category that make them unique. But in general, again, you have things like nandrolone, you have things like trestolone, and trestolone again, it, it's very estrogenic, which, nandrolone is lesser so, but nandrolone in itself also has its own effect that can enhance the estrogenicity of certain testosterone and testosterone derivatives when it's used in conjunction with one another. While this was initially meant to be a video simplifying the process, I realize now, 20 minutes in, that it has become a more elaborate and overly complicated video, but hopefully you can appreciate the detail I'm going into here. But anyways, the nandrolone column, 19-nors are typically known for their volume and tissue selectivity. And in addition to that, they have a lot of, like satellite interaction with other receptors that would otherwise not be interacted with, which is largely why it has very, very hit or miss side effects for a lot of people and requires a lot more, expertise and is less well tolerated by many individuals. And on top of that, they're very heavily suppressive and will keep you suppressed for months on end after discontinuation because they're more suppressive at even minuscule amounts than something like a Dht derivative is. So this is why if you've even used a 19-nor in general in your cycle, and then you think that somehow you're going to come off after 2 weeks and be ready with your HPTA no longer suppressed and recover endogenous androgen production, it's not going to happen. And then it's funny because it almost behaves more like a testosterone. So you have certain compounds in each category which have their own, way they interact and whatnot, because these are, at the end of the day, regardless of where they derive from, they were refined and developed in a way to have certain action and can behave like these other categories. But in general, you have the things like testosterone, D-bol, EQ, and the testosterone family that all behave very similarly to, certain extent. In the Dht derivative column, you have, Primo, Anavar, Winstrol, Masteron, which all, sort of behave like one another as well. And then in the 19-nor category, you have very few compounds. You have, typically driving volume with that category. And on top of that, they have their own effect on, like red blood cell production, erythropoietin, like I mentioned earlier, and they have their own effect on like the downstream IGF-1, whatnot, and the GH pathway and stuff. It's all, there's so many random things to consider, and it does get overly complicated. But at the end of the day, you would be best served by starting your education about this stuff by splitting them into the three families and sort of like realizing, the base of estrogen, how estrogen contributes to neuro and cardio protection, and where, the sort of, I've done videos on this before as well. If you want to get into more detail, I highly recommend you watch my videos on estrogen and, where the test base came from. Because at the end of the day, the first column you should ever be looking at, if you're going to get into this stuff, is, while you can, call nandrolone bioidentical, you should be looking at the testosterone column, because this is the only way you're going to aromatize a sufficient amount of estrogen to support physiologic functions that would otherwise not be addressed properly if you were using any other category. This is why you don't use Dht derivatives on their own. This is why you don't use 19-nors on their own, unless, there's very hyper specific situations whereby, like nandrolone monotherapy may be an option for some people, not an option, but maybe something worth exploring and researching. But again, that comes down to an even more, hyper specific situation where somebody has individual specific side effects that requires them to look to other categories to satisfy some, need for their athletic endeavors that otherwise can't be satisfied by this testosterone column because of a side effect / reaction to this column. But in general, the testosterone column is the first thing you should learn and understand well before you then delve into learning about the DHT column, before you delve into learning about the nandrolone column. And that is the sort of general progression I would advise you research about in clinical studies, my other videos, whatever source of information you get from. If you have a coach, and he is willing to teach you about this stuff, I would hope they do, and they don't just, regurgitate a cookie cutter plan and then tell you like, this is what you have to do. They should probably have some sort of reason why you're, picking certain compounds from certain columns and what interactions have and what attributes they're trying to pull from them specifically that are going to complement your specific goals the best. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, somebody who's like a UFC fighter versus a bodybuilder versus a cyclist versus a basketball player versus a football player versus a whatever, a skateboarder, like whatever, the choice of anabolic agents or performance enhancing drugs in general is going to vastly differ between all these individuals based on their needs and things they need to accentuate and really own in on and maximize relative to. Like, you're not gonna, put a middleweight UFC fighter on the top end of the, weight class. You're not gonna throw him on like nandrolone deca test. You know what I mean? Like, it would just be nonsensical. So there's a lot of things to consider here. It's a lot of information to take in. It can be somewhat overwhelming, but the easy way to really approach this and tackle this and really develop your knowledge here is break it down into the families and just learn about them step by step. Don't overwhelm yourself with all the knowledge and all like the random receptors and whatnot that are ultimately going to be negligible when you're first starting your education process. Just learn how testosterone works. Learn what interactions it has in the body, learn about estrogen, what that has in the role that has in the body. Very basic stuff before you even think about learning the other stuff. And don't use any of the shit before you learn this stuff, because this is something I wish I knew way back, and this is why I'm making these videos to begin with. So don't make mistakes. Make sure you understand this stuff thoroughly first. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, actually comment and like. It does help the algorithm a lot. So it's very much appreciated when you guys do that. And it helps, grow the brand, grow the following and whatnot, and bring the videos on the recommended for other people who might be looking for this content, but would otherwise not find my stuff because it's not, being picked up by the algorithm or whatever. So it does really help when you guys do that. So please do that. Like I said, subscribe, notification bell. You won't get notified when I post if you don't do that. As far as not being overwhelmed by rambling content, which, I hope most of you guys who are watching this are trying to learn something, so the ramblings would hopefully be appreciated in many respects. But my articles, if you've ever read my articles, you probably know they're more professionally laid out than the videos. They have concise subsections with table of content, with hyperlinks in them to the clinical studies I reference that you can go delve into deeper yourself. They're basically more refined and more professionally laid out versions of my content, and I would highly recommend you click the first link in the video description to get notified every time I publish an article. That's a mailing list where essentially anytime I publish an article, it gets sent right to your inbox, and then you get the highest quality of my content sent to you directly. And you're not going to get that content otherwise. So highly recommend you do that. Also follow me on Instagram at moreplates_more_dates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, BitChute, TikTok, etc. Apple Podcasts, wherever else I am. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.